Hello, everyone. Welcome to 1.5 Degrees, the podcast where together we explore the science, solutions, and stories involved in the fight against climate change. I'm your host, Heidi Pan, speaking with the professionals behind the latest research, policies, culture, and innovations shaping our response to global environmental challenges. For today's episode, we are joined by Dr. Nadir Jeevanjee, who is a research physical scientist at the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration and a member of Climate Up Close to discuss the current landscape of climate science, science communication, and more. Before turning to climate science, Dr. Jeevanjee studied mathematical physics for many years, during which he authored the textbook An Introduction to Tensors and Group Theory for Physicists, and he has also previously held postdoctoral positions in Princeton Geosciences, as well as Princeton's AOS program, and he received his PhD in 2016 from UC Berkeley, working with David Romps. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Jeevanjee. It's truly an honor.
Sure, good to see you.
Yeah, no, we met at the symposium in Princeton, and I guess just for some listeners, can you tell us what your work as a research physical scientist at the NOAA's Geophysical Fluid Dynamics Laboratory looks like?
Sure. Well, we are a climate modeling center. So we build computer models of the climate and run them on giant supercomputers. This lab was actually essentially the first to develop a global climate model way back in the 60s, and is still, kind of one of the world's foremost modeling centers. There's now lots of modeling centers around the world, a few dozen. And my role, given my background in physics, is really to try and we've built these, these massive models that simulate an incredible amount of detail of the Earth's climate, from the large-scale circulating of the atmosphere to convection and thunderstorms and cloud formation, to the circulation of the ocean, to response of the land biosphere, the plants and the trees, and really everything in between. And I see it as my job to try and understand some of the fundamental physical mechanisms operating, in these models and presumably on planet Earth. I specialize in the atmosphere and in studying the physics of clouds and convection, and also greenhouse gases, and kind of more generally how global warming arises as a response to that greenhouse gas forcing.
Yeah, no, and there's a lot of physics aspects to this. And I mean, like prior to this, you had been in mathematical areas. And I
Yeah,
guess what led you to make that shift? And I mean, I'm sure physics is still very much a big part of what you do today.
it is. Yeah, I started off in theoretical physics, pencil and paper, very esoteric stuff, quantum gravity, trying to unite quantum mechanics with Einstein's general relativity. And I was drawn to that by the mathematical elegance of it and by the profundity of the ideas, and studied it for several years, and tried my hand at research in it in a few different subfields. I think there was a couple of things going on. One, that it was tough to find, theoretical physics. There's so many brilliant people working on it. It's hard to find a good problem that wasn't already kind of saturated, with a lot of brilliant people already working on it. And by the time you get to the research frontier, some of the problems can feel pretty abstract, pretty far removed from not only everyday experience, but even kind of reality, and it was really fun to kind of work with the mathematical theories, but it grew harder and harder to convince oneself that they were real, in some sense. And at the same time, this was in Berkeley in the 2000s and 2010s, and environmental awareness was building, climate change was a front page problem, reading about it in the newspapers all the time, a lot of activity on campus, a lot of talk about the different solutions. So I started to get interested in that. And then I taught a course, I TA'd a course taught by this professor, Rich Muller, called Physics for Future Presidents. And it was sort of a course about how, basic physics underlies so much phenomena technology that is just everyday and relevant. So this course, showed how physics was the underpinning for electric cars and nuclear energy, the electric grid, global warming, etc. And that course just really opened my eyes. I was like, oh,
Mhm.
all this physics that I know and love is actually what's behind all these problems that I'm reading about on the front page. So maybe I could, try and apply physics to these problems. So I got excited about that idea. And I did an internship at a think tank, more on the solution side one summer. And then after that, I came back to Berkeley, and there was a new professor, David Romps, who I ended up working with, who had just arrived. He himself was a former string theorist, theoretical physicist who had switched to studying clouds and convection.
Mm.
And I met with him. It seemed like a good fit, and I switched, and more or less didn't look back.
Yeah, that's super cool. So it seems to be the kind of like applied aspect of it that kind of brought you to this area. And I mean, definitely like I'm currently taking like the very introductory courses to physics, and like
Yeah.
honestly it was conversations with you that's keeping me interested.
Well, that's
Yeah. Yeah. No, but there was a lot of like really sides to it, or the science aspect of it, that like I, as an everyday person that isn't always exposed to this kind of stuff, was just I didn't really know much about it.
uh-huh.
That was, yeah. And I mean, I guess like that goes into the other aspect of what you do, is just also like science communication. I
Uh-huh.
mean, what does like how did you get into this field, and what does it mean to you? And I guess like I'd also love to talk about like what your approach independently, or with climate up close and sea
Yeah.
change is like, yeah.
Right. Right. Yeah. I mean, I guess I always liked teaching, and I did a lot of it even as a grad student, TAing and teaching some of my own courses during the summers, especially. And so that was always something that was fun, and I felt comfortable doing and enjoyed connecting with audiences. In terms of, science communication really aimed at the public as opposed to, students in the classroom. I think I arrived in Princeton as a postdoc in 2016. A couple months later, you know, Trump was elected, and the political winds just changed very drastically from the Obama administration. And there was also a lot of, there was some kind of lingering climate skepticism that then was given greater voice, given this change of the administration. And that was even reflected on campus, because at Princeton, there's a handful of physicists, um, notably one, Will Happer, who were outspoken skeptics of climate change and of climate science. And given just that political environment, and even just what was happening on campus, I didn't feel comfortable just kind of ignoring it all and just putting my nose to the grindstone and focusing on research. I felt like, um, someone should be out there speaking for the science, trying to connect with skeptics and hear their questions and trying to address them. Some of what I learned when I came to Princeton is that there were these skeptical voices at Princeton, and they were just basically being ignored.
Mm.
And I didn't think that was the right response.
Yeah.
And Will Happer in particular had like particular claims
Hmm.
about climate science. He thought we were overestimating the greenhouse effect from CO2. And I thought, well, isn't that something we can get to the bottom of as scientists?
Yeah.
Put some numbers to this and try and converge. Um, so yeah, so that motivated me to reach out to him, and then also to start giving some public lectures about how we know what we know about climate science. Because another thing that I was uncomfortable with was those folks who engage, journalists or others engaged in climate communication, who were familiar with the science and felt that it was settled. The rhetoric seemed to be that if anyone raised any questions, the response was, the science is settled. You can read about it in the IPCC report, and your questions are just out of place and are a nuisance.
Mm.
And that made me uncomfortable. Science is all about asking questions. That's what we do. And climate science itself is complicated, and is encapsulated in these 1,000-page reports. And so if a physicist or an engineer or someone else in another field has some questions about it, I didn't see why we shouldn't at least try to answer them to some reasonable extent, as opposed to just kind of throw the book at people.
Yeah.
And yeah, so I thought, so the first public lectures I gave were called, climate science, how do we know what we know? And instead of just telling people, oh, we've got a big problem and the ice is melting and the globe is warming and all that, just showing them a little bit of the data and the evidence of why we're so confident that global warming is real and humans are causing it. Yeah, so that's where I got started.
Yeah, no, and I mean that work is super important. Like I had begun to learn more about climate sciences, and there was just stuff that seemed like it was empirical almost, like the
Uh-huh.
ha about, global warming being inextricably tied to like extreme weather events. And
Uh-huh.
to find out that that isn't 100% settled, and I mean, yeah, I wanted to go into like what more other things in the current, like I guess climate conversation landscape, I think you called it.
Yes.
What are there, yeah, what are some like assumptions or, things that worry you that you would hope would change? And do you ever see us getting to that point in the near future?
Things that I would hope would change with the public
Yeah, I
conversation.
guess so. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. So, I mean, I guess so the first thing is just to maybe expand upon that point that you noted, that there really is a spectrum of certainty about different aspects of climate change. And, different climate scientists will give you different answers.
Mhm.
So I don't, science is often presented like it's objective, like there's one way to interpret the evidence. That only happens once a lot of evidence is accumulated and we really
Mhm.
understand things very well.
Yeah.
Whenever you're at the frontier of science, the evidence is kind of a mishmash. You can interpret it different ways, you get different factions, right? There are scientific controversies you know, that exist, and it's part of how we learn. Um, and so, yeah, so there is this spectrum of certainty and it's evolving, where certain things like the fact that the globe overall is warming, that it's related to the CO2 increase, that the CO2 increase is man-made, that it's leading to sea level rise, which we can observe and measure, that's leading to an increase in heat waves. All these things are pretty well settled.
Mhm.
Um, then you come to extreme weather events or other extreme weather events, and there it's a little bit more of a mishmash. We expect that flooding should get worse, that droughts would exacerbate. We're not totally sure what tropical cyclones will do, actually,
Mhm.
especially in terms of their frequency. And this is in terms of our physical understanding and our predictions. And then when you look at the observed data, it's often we don't have great data. The spatial coverage is spotty. The temporal records are poor, and so it can be difficult to test these hypotheses sometimes. And so, for depending on the weather event, it's not a slam dunk. Um, and if you already believe in climate change, and then you see certain trends, say in flood frequency or drought frequency, you go, oh yeah, that kind of fits. But if you're skeptical about climate change, it's not like the signal to noise ratio is so good that you would have to believe that climate change is behind it. You could
Mhm.
probably keep on believing that, oh, there's just a lot of natural variability and it's a very noisy phenomenon. So that's a little bit of a gray area there. And then when it comes to really uncertain things, like certain things about like the carbon cycle and what's going to happen with the permafrost and what the fate of the Antarctic ice sheets are going to be, those are just huge question marks. Um, and I don't feel that um, I feel that I know that in public communication it's hard to get nuance across, but I actually
Mhm.
think in this subject it's just critical that we do that, and that we say there is really the spectrum, and some things are just the jury's still out. Doesn't mean we shouldn't worry about them, doesn't mean we shouldn't study them, doesn't even mean that climate models aren't telling us what to expect, but sometimes we just can't be sure we're seeing it yet. Um, and um, and I think that actually has a broader social implication, because this has become a very controversial subject. It's still politicized, and I just wonder if the science itself, if there's a spectrum of certainty, you know, shouldn't that then naturally lead, or shouldn't that naturally then make room for, um, a diversity of voices and thought
Mhm.
regarding it? So if some people think it's the most urgent issue facing humanity, fine, I can understand that. But if other people feel like, okay, it's an issue, but there's lots of other big issues out there with geopolitical stability and poverty and famine and water availability across the world, if someone else wants to prioritize those, I think there should be space for that too. And then trying to bring it all together to figure out where realistically we can fit
Mhm.
climate in. As opposed to, I feel like there's a very strong faction that says, climate is the biggest problem and then we have to put all the resources we have into it. Nothing else matters. I sort of struggle with that. Um,
Mhm.
there was a recent article by gosh, Ben O'Neill. I could look it up for you. It was an op-ed, and I think it was published in Nature Climate Change. And he makes a really relevant point, kind of related to what I'm saying, which is that, yes, certainly climate change, on its own, it exacerbates risks, right? Risks from flood and drought, risks of famine, risks of human migration. But if you project that into the future, climate change by itself compounds those risks, but there's many, many other things that happen as human societies develop, as technology improves, that actually ameliorates those risks. Right? I mean, agricultural practices, for instance, development and building practices, for instance, right? And those things are going to improve the quality and stability of life for people around the world, as they have for the last 100 years. I mean, for decades and centuries, right? As the world has developed, that will continue to happen. Impacts from climate change may slow it, but it's very unlikely to be the case that in 50 years from now, people will be worse off because of climate change, right? Humanity tends to become better and better off over time because humans are so creative and clever, right? Climate change will be superimposed on that in ways that aren't beneficial, but that will still happen. I think it's another important thing to keep in mind, just when we try to put climate change in context, for ourselves, and then hopefully with in the context of a conversation with the rest of society.
Yeah, no, and I really want to go into, I guess, like your thoughts then on like tipping points and whatnot. But before that, like I really wanted to just touch on, like, I mean, your perspective, like, and the nuance of it was really refreshing to me. Like it was I mean, just the idea that it's a spectrum and there are gray areas is something that we don't talk about enough, unfortunately. Like, or at least the spaces that I've been in. Like sometimes, if you question a certain statistic on, how likely it is that climate change is related to, extreme events, then you're labeled as a skeptic.
Yes.
Like, yeah, and versus, if you're, completely buying into everything, and that isn't like exactly constructive either. So yeah, no, just really appreciate that. I mean, the point is just we need to be aware of the facts and whatnot. So yeah, and I mean, like you had previously said, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, but like you had said you didn't exactly align with the idea of, science tells us X, that's, often said. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Well, I mean, so again, this is in reference to this guest lecture that I gave at the John Locke Institute. You mean in terms of science telling us what to do?
Yeah, I guess so.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of communication out there, and some of it from climate scientists, very well respected, excellent climate scientists, where the narrative is, the science is clear. We must do X. We must cut emissions, by percentage X, by year Y. I find that kind of narrative confusing and counterproductive, because science can tell you about what we think will happen in terms of causes and effect, but any decision we make about how to allocate resources, how much to spend investing in renewable energy and in revamping our electric grid, how much to spend in removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, how much land to use for solar panels and for carbon dioxide removal and for afforestation, those all involve huge trade-offs.
Yeah.
In terms of our time, energy, land, and other resources. And as I was just mentioning, humanity is and is always facing a multitude of problems, as are countries and communities on smaller scales. And so, to me, the idea that science could tell you how to handle those trade-offs, I just don't see how that's true. Those trade-off, negotiating those trade-offs in a society where we all, bring our own values to it, is really a question of values and how we combine our individual values and construct shared values out of them. And that's the cacophony of democracy that's happening all the time and playing out in state houses and Congress houses in our country and all over the world. And it's a messy, messy business, as it should be. And and I think has always been, as long as we've had these institutions. And I think that's where, we figure out how much we're going to do and how fast, because we're going to be trading all these things off against the other things that we could be doing. and the other social ills that we have. So when I, for me, when I think about it in that broader context, the idea that, an IPCC report is going to tell us how much to spend, or on what time frame, I just don't think that's true. I think for people who are a little skeptical or just, value other problems, are more concerned with other problems, it turns them off to be told that, oh, there's actually no wiggle room here, and there's no room for your values, because science is objective and the science is telling us what to do. And so if you're not with the program, like, you're just not into objective truth. I think that's very alienating. And I think it just fundamentally misunderstands the role of science and what science can and cannot do.
That's a really great point. Yeah, and it gives them something to push back on, or use to push back on.
Yes,
yeah,
absolutely. That's my read. Yep.
Yeah, no, and I agree with that. Yeah, and I mean, I also, I guess, like, want to go then into your perspective on tipping points. Like, the podcast is called 1.5 degrees.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so to be honest, I think this is another point, and actually Michael Mann just has, I think he's got a new book out which addresses this. He just wrote an op-ed in the APS News. APS is the American Physical Society that addresses this and makes some similar points. But so tipping points are these thresholds that one might reach in the globe or in subsystems of the globe, where you might get an abrupt change with just some small increment of warming or forcing. And this abrupt change could have to do with, sea ice or Antarctic glaciers or the Amazon. Or maybe there's some amplifying feedback where the Amazon dies off, or some self-amplifying feedback with, carbon release from permafrost. And these are, so there's some models, climate models, or there's some scientific models that display this, usually very simplified, display this kind of behavior. Often the behavior doesn't survive when you look at things in a more comprehensive way and include more effects. Because when you have a lot of effects going on, it just tends to stabilize things. And so I guess there's a couple things to say. So one is that, well, let's see. Right, so there's a communications piece where I think, but some of these tipping points are very scary, right? The idea that all of a sudden the Amazon would just like start dying, and then that would, trigger some feedback where it would just, die back very quickly. And so I think for those in the communication space who, want to paint a scary picture to get people to act, the likelihood of the tipping points, in my view, and again, I'm not speaking for NOAA or for my laboratory here. This is my read as a scientist. I think the likelihood of some of these things has been blown out of proportion, and has become cause for concern that's not warranted. I mean, some of them, they're all worth study, and some of them, the Antarctic ice sheets, the melting is accelerating. That is worrisome. And some of the mechanisms that are been proposed for tipping points, there's a couple of them: the marine ice cliff instability, the marine ice sheet instability. Some are more plausible than others. Not clear if they're really kicking in yet. I'm not saying that they should be ignored or discounted entirely, but the jury's not really in on any of them.
Right.
We don't have confidence in any of them that they're really operating. But maybe, and some of them are certainly, plausible. But so yes, I think the confidence we have in them has been blown out of proportion. They've been misrepresented in the media, either wittingly or unwittingly. And the other problem is that they've been conflated with these temperature targets, the 1.5 degree target, after which your podcast is named, or the 2 degree target. And there's been a misconception, and again, this is what Michael Mann has written about. There's been a misconception, and it's understandable, but there's been a misconception and a conflation that these targets correspond to tipping points. That if we hit these targets, these tipping points will kick in. That's actually not been written anywhere in the literature. It's just that in the messaging about climate change, messengers talk about the targets, they talk about the tipping points, and it's natural to think that those targets are the thresholds. They're not, right? 2 degrees Celsius is a number that didn't come from any threshold or tipping point. If you actually dig through the literature on this, which I've done, people had to pick a number. And some scientists noted that the last time, we've been through these ice age cycles. And so if you go back to right now we're in a so-called interglacial, the time between ice ages that tend to last 10 to 20,000 years. The last interglacial was 120,000 years ago, and it was about 2 Celsius warmer than today. And we know that Homo sapiens appeared around that time, and hominids had been evolving kind of throughout that time. So we know that, as a species, we can kind of live through that, right? So as far as I can tell from the literature, that's where the 2 degrees Celsius number came from. It was just a comparison to the last interglacial. It's not it's not a number derived from any tipping point.
Yeah.
And same with 1.5.
Yeah, no, and another side of that, I don't know if this is what you meant exactly, but like just sometimes there's an assumption that, once we reach these, that everything is reversed immediately. And I mean, I don't know, it doesn't seem like that's the case either, but I mean, yeah, it's just the possibility that there is those tipping points though is certainly like that's scary. And it, I don't know, like the part about climate communications in scaring people into action is something I also personally have some issues with. But yeah, no, thank you so much for that. And yeah, would definitely really appreciate any like literature that you would recommend everyone go into more. But yeah, I mean, to kind of close off, what is some advice that you would give to someone who is interested in pursuing what you do? And I guess like, is there anything that you didn't expect to be doing or any challenges that you encountered that, everyone should be aware of?
You just mean as kind of like a physical scientist studying the physical science of climate change?
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, one thing about it is that, you're studying the whole Earth. And so that's part of the fun of it, is that you can never get bored because there's always some new subfield to study. I myself have worked on how clouds form. I've worked on the greenhouse effect. I think about the sensitivity of the climate. I'm starting to branch out into new fields, like thinking about the carbon cycle or thinking about how cloud droplets form, the microphysics of clouds. So there's just it feels like a never ending supply of problems. And the field is just wide open. It's a young field. So again, unlike theoretical physics, which I just felt was saturated, there's just people had thought so hard about it for so long that a lot of the big ideas had been explored. I mean, obviously, there's still some new places to go, but whereas in climate science, I mean, there are just huge vistas of things to explore that we just haven't gotten around to because it's kind of a young field and there's so much to do. So it's part of what's exciting about it, but it also is hard because there's so much to learn, and the complexity of it can be daunting sometimes. And especially working in this laboratory where we build climate models, I mean, the complexity of the models is really daunting. And there's probably not any single person who understands the whole model. And it makes it very tricky to develop the models because it does unexpected things. And then we have a very hard time figuring out why. So it's a really hard problem. But we need like the best minds to work on it. And so, if you like math or physics, or just if you just kind of have a hungry mind that likes to think about a lot of different things, climate science is a wonderful field. And the satisfaction of working on something so many people care about, that's such a live problem, that's tremendous. When I was studying theoretical physics, I would ask myself, like, does this matter? I didn't always have a good answer. And as a climate scientist, I never worry about that. I know that this work is worthwhile.
Yeah, that's really important. Thank you. And also, this is something I ask every episode, but if you had the chance to turn back time, we're gonna ignore the fact that that's not physically possible, or butterflies aside or not. But if you could turn back time and go back to, I guess, I don't know, like at any point, maybe in the beginning of your career, or if you're like, I don't know, my age, 17 or something, like what is something that that you've learned from life that you wish you had known earlier or could say to them?
Oh boy. I think for me, a sort of overarching lesson is the way that things find their equilibrium over time. And I think that applies to people, relationships, and to physical systems. I think to me, it's almost like a fundamental law of the world that, of course, there's always forces that push things out, but there's also always a natural tendency, and so I think there's a tendency for people to find their place in the world. Sometimes they have to search, and I certainly did plenty of searching. I spent years in graduate school and struggled to find my place. And even once I found climate science in the first year or two, I wasn't sure it was a fit, because it was so messy and complicated. And it felt very different from physics for a long time. So I think a personal level, it's, it took some time to find my place. I think relationships can be the same way, with friends and spouses and family, to kind of like settle and find that balance. And I think for us as a society, we're struggling with that. How do we settle into a world where we balance climate change against other priorities? But I already feel it happening. I think people in the climate space, there's a lot of despair. And I get it. And I certainly don't begrudge anyone that despair. I don't feel it personally, because I think I just have some faith in that balance. You might be surprised to hear a scientist talking about faith, but I actually think faith is really important in living life. And I'm starting to see the world come into balance when I see, the degree of acceptance in climate change, certainly across Europe and across much of the developed world. I see the acceptance of climate change increasing here in America over time, even though it's contentious and it's bumpy and there's 2 steps forward, 1 step back, but the trend is certainly, in one direction. And I see the way the world is changing. The electric cars on the road and windmills, wind turbines being put up and solar panels, and the way we're talking about, electrifying everything. And the fact that we finally did manage to pass some legislation on the federal level that acts to combat climate change, which is a first, right?
Yeah.
And so the needle is moving and things are shifting, because I think in the end of the day, the truth wins out. And people when the truth is the truth and people deep down know it, and the truth just operates in the world, sometimes slowly. And that's part of that, the world kind of balancing out. And so that's something that I see. For me, that gives me faith. And it keeps me going, and I don't despair.
Yeah, that's really great. Well put. Thank you so much for that. Yeah, and I want to respect your time. So I guess like for listeners who want to keep up with what you're doing, or those who want to pursue climate sciences, what resources do you recommend them, and where can they find your work?
Yeah, I mean, I maintain a personal website, and it's a priority of mine to try to make the science accessible. And so I've done a bit of writing that's for I guess a little bit. I don't know if you go to my website, there's sort of a variety of resources that are anything from for a popular audience to undergraduates to graduate students, and these range from videos of lectures to articles that I've written for online magazines or op-eds that I've written. And so I try to make those freely available on the web. I wrote a pedagogical article that's accessible to undergraduates in physics that introduces some of the big ideas in climate science. It's called Climate Sensitivity from Radiative Convective Equilibrium, a Blackboard approach. And it's the kind of thing that if you're a junior in physics, undergraduate, you could read it. And, I post these PDFs and try to make them available. So yeah, I would just direct someone to my website or invite them just to, email me, reach out to me directly.
Thank you so much for that. And thank you so much for speaking. And I again learned so much.
It was my pleasure, Heidi. And, it's inspiring to see young people like you who are so inspired and are, doing things like this podcast just out of your own initiative, and energy and enthusiasm. And, I draw inspiration from that, and it reinforces my faith, that that when there is a real problem, young people take it up, and the world moves forward.